3 drunk men were provoking the royal guard, mocking him, testing him, daring him to move. Dozens of tourists stood by, even security held back. And then they crossed the line. That's when an 11-year-old boy stepped out from the crowd. Wasn't just any child. It was Prince George. He said one sentence and made them feel smaller than their own shadows. And when one of them reached for him, the guard finally moved. But before we show you how centuries of silence shattered in a single moment, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get into it. The July morning carried that particular London quality where the air feels both ancient and alive. Buckingham Palace sat against the blue sky, its windows catching sunlight and throwing it back at the gathering crowd. Tourists had already claimed their spots along the black railings, clutching guidebooks with the focused intensity of people who'd travelled thousands of miles for this moment. The changing of the guard would begin soon, and with it, that strange theatre of absolute stillness that had somehow survived wars, scandals, and centuries of change. Behind the main tourist barriers, in a section most visitors never saw, stood a boy who didn't need a guidebook. Prince George, 11 years old and dressed in a navy blazer that had been pressed within an inch of its life, kept his hands clasped behind his back as he watched the preparations unfold. His posture was straight, not stiff, just present, like someone who'd been taught that watching was a skill worth developing. This wasn't his first ceremony, but it was his first time observing alone, without parents hovering nearby explaining every detail. A test run, his father had called it. A chance to see how he handled himself when the training wheels came off. The protection officer beside him, a compact man with intelligent eyes, and the kind of stillness that came from years of watching for things that shouldn't be there, said nothing unless spoken to. That was the protocol when the prince was learning. Let him observe, let him process, let him begin to understand what he'd inherited. From beyond the ceremonial gates, the first sounds of the approaching guard drifted across the forecourt. Boot heels on stone, the distant clatter of brass instruments, the particular quiet that settles over a crowd when something important is about to begin. George leaned forward slightly. Not enough to be obvious, just enough to see better. He'd always been like this during ceremonies, absolutely focused in a way that sometimes unnerved adults. His mother said he absorbed things like a sponge, filing away details most people missed entirely. The scarlet column came into view first. 24 men in perfect formation, their bearskin caps adding inches to already impressive heights. Behind them, the regimental band struck up a march that had been played for longer than most buildings in London had existed. The sound rolled across the square like a tide, filling every corner with something that felt both celebratory and solemn. Tourist cameras went up. Voices dropped to whispers. Children were lifted onto shoulders for better views. It was the same choreography that played out every other day, year after year, decade after decade. But George wasn't watching the main formation. His attention had caught on something else, a single guardsman posted near the rope barrier that separated the ceremony from the crowd, different from the others somehow, not in appearance, but in presence. The man stood perfectly motionless, rifle angled down and to the right, face unreadable beneath his bearskin hat. But there was something in his stillness that felt different from ceremonial training, something watchful, alert. George studied him with the kind of attention most people reserved for puzzles they couldn't quite solve. The guardsman's name was Elliot Marsh, though George didn't know that yet. Before the red tunic and palace postings, Elliot had worn desert camouflage in places where standing still meant staying alive. Helmand Province had taught him things about discipline that no parade ground ever could. How to read a crowd for signs of trouble. How to separate genuine threat from harmless noise. Most tourists saw the guards as living statues. Elliot knew better. He was a sensor, a tripwire, a man trained to notice things that didn't belong. And right now, something didn't belong. 3 men had pushed their way to the front of the tourist barrier, elbowing past families and elderly couples with the kind of aggressive entitlement that made other people step aside. They weren't kids looking for social media content. These were grown men, late 20s at least, with the particular swagger that came from too much alcohol consumed too early in the day. The biggest wore a stained England football jersey that had seen better decades. His arms were thick with amateur tattoos, one hand bandaged like he'd been in a recent fight. When he laughed, which he did often and loudly, his breath carried the sour tang of cheap lager. His companions weren't much better. One held a bottle of cider that he wasn't bothering to hide. The other kept checking his phone, recording bits of their performance. They'd positioned themselves directly in front of Elliot's post, not accidentally. "Look at this one," the big man said, gesturing toward Elliot with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never been taught that other people had feelings. "Proper robot, isn't he? Bet he doesn't even blink." His friends laughed with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested they'd been building up to this moment for a while. This wasn't spontaneous mockery. It was planned entertainment. Elliot heard every word. He always did, but his training was absolute. You do not engage unless physically contacted. You do not speak. You do not acknowledge. You let them exhaust themselves against your silence like waves against stone. Most people eventually got bored and moved on. These three had no intention of moving on. "Oi, toy soldier!" the big man called out, loud enough to draw stares from other tourists. "What's it like being a museum exhibit? Do they feed you, or do you just photosynthesize?" A little girl nearby tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mummy, why are they being mean to the soldier?" Her mother didn't answer. She just pulled her daughter back, away from whatever this was becoming. George noticed the shift in the crowd, the way people started creating distance, the way conversations dropped to whispers. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as he watched the three men work themselves into something uglier than simple mockery. "Sir?" his protection officer said quietly, noting the change in the prince's posture. George didn't respond. He was too busy watching, learning, processing what happened when ceremony met cruelty. The man in the football jersey wasn't done. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a crushed can of lager, half empty and still hissing foam from a crack in the metal. Without warning, he lobbed it toward Elliot's feet. The can hit the stone with a metallic clang, spraying beer across the ancient cobblestones and splattering the hem of Elliot's trousers. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Phones went up, not for ceremony anymore, but for evidence. Elliot didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge that anything had happened at all. His eyes remained fixed on a point in the middle distance, his breathing steady, his grip on his rifle unchanged. But inside, every instinct he'd developed in combat zones was screaming warnings. This wasn't random harassment anymore, this was escalation. "What's wrong, statue man?" the second drunk called out. "Can't even dodge a can. What kind of soldier are you?" The crowd had gone quiet now. Even the band seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, their tempo becoming slightly less certain. George stepped closer to the inner barrier, his hands unclenching from behind his back. "Sir," his protection officer said again, "I recommend we step back." But George wasn't stepping back. He was leaning forward, his young face hardening with something that looked remarkably like anger. The man with the camera pointed it directly at Elliot's face. "Smile for the internet, robot. Let's see if you're even human under there." That's when the big man decided to get creative. He reached into his other pocket and pulled out something worse than a beer can. A plastic bottle filled with what looked like piss, the yellow liquid sloshing against the sides. "Bet this'll make him move," he said, with the kind of smile that belonged in nightmares. Several tourists started backing away now, parents lifting children and murmuring about finding somewhere else to watch. The atmosphere had crossed from uncomfortable into dangerous. This wasn't going to end with mockery. The man drew his arm back, and George moved. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply walked forward with the kind of calm determination that made adults forget he was only 11 years old. His stride was measured, his chin level, his eyes locked on the three men like he was approaching a podium to give a speech. The protection officer reacted immediately. Hand to radio, urgent whispers. But he didn't grab the prince. Protocol was clear. Do not lay hands on a royal unless imminent threat is confirmed. George walked until he was standing just behind the rope barrier, close enough to speak without raising his voice. The drunk with the bottle noticed him first. "What's this then? Another tourist?" The other two turned, their expressions shifting from aggressive confidence to confusion. This wasn't part of their plan. George looked directly at the man holding the bottle. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and clear, the voice of someone who'd been taught that words had power and should be used carefully. "You're not brave," he said simply. "Brave people don't pick on someone who can't fight back." The bottle lowered slightly. What did you say, kid? I said you're not brave. You're three grown men attacking one person who isn't allowed to defend himself. That's not strength, that's cowardice. The crowd had gone absolutely silent now. Even the band seemed to be playing more quietly, as if the entire ceremony was holding its breath. The man in the football jersey stepped closer to the rope, his face flushing with anger and embarrassment. Listen here, you little— No! George interrupted, his voice never rising above conversational level, but somehow carrying absolute authority. You listen. That man is a soldier. He's trained to protect people like you, even when you don't deserve it. He's standing there because it's his duty, not because he's weak. The second man, the one with the cider, tried to laugh it off. Just having a bit of fun, aren't we? No harm done. George's gaze shifted to him, with the kind of precision that made adults uncomfortable. Throwing things at someone isn't fun. It's assault. And doing it to someone who can't respond is the kind of thing cowards do when they want to feel important. The words hung in the air like a challenge. The three men looked at each other, suddenly aware that they'd lost control of their performance. The man with the bottle took a step closer to the rope. You think you're better than us, rich boy? George didn't back down. I think anyone who treats another person with respect is better than you're being right now. That did it. The man's face twisted with rage, and he grabbed the rope barrier with one hand, swinging his leg over to cross into the ceremonial area. Let's see how brave you are when— He didn't finish the sentence, because the moment his foot touched the sacred ground, two things happened simultaneously. The protection officer surged forward, hand on his sidearm, and from across the square, a blur of scarlet broke formation. Elliot Marsh had moved, not in the measured, ceremonial pace of parade drill, not with the careful precision of someone worried about protocol. He moved like a soldier who'd spent years learning that sometimes rules mattered less than lives. He vaulted the rope barrier in a single fluid motion, his rifle raised but not aimed, a warning posture that managed to be both professional and terrifying. The drunk who'd crossed the line didn't even have time to react. Elliot's shoulder caught him centre mass, driving him backward and down onto the cobblestones with the kind of controlled force that suggested extensive experience in subduing people without causing permanent damage. The bottle flew from the man's hand, shattering against stone and spraying its contents across the ancient courtyard. The other two men started forward, caught between loyalty to their friend and sudden, sobering awareness that they'd crossed into something far more serious than harassment. Elliot didn't give them time to decide. The second man swung his cider bottle in a wide arc, aiming for Elliot's head. Elliot caught his wrist mid-swing, twisted downward with surgical precision, and drove his knee into the man's solar plexus. The bottle dropped. The man followed it down, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The third man tried to tackle Elliot from behind, probably hoping to overwhelm him with surprise and momentum. But Elliot had been ambushed by actual insurgents in actual combat zones. He sidestepped at the last second, grabbed the man's jacket, and used his own momentum to slam him face first into the ground. From the first rope crossing to the last man hitting stone, less than 15 seconds had elapsed. Sirens wailed from beyond the gates as uniformed royal protection officers flooded the square, but they weren't needed anymore. 3 grown men lay groaning on cobblestones that had witnessed centuries of history, and none of them were in any condition to cause further trouble. George stood behind his protection officer now, breathing hard but steady. His blazer was rumpled, one button missing where someone had grabbed at him, but his eyes were clear, focused, processing everything that had just happened. Elliot stood over the subdued men, his rifle lowered but ready. His breathing was controlled, professional, his expression unreadable beneath the bearskin hat. The head of ceremonial security approached, flanked by officers who looked like they'd seen this kind of thing before, but hoped they wouldn't have to see it again. "Guardsman Marsh," the commander said, his voice carrying the weight of formal inquiry. "Report." Elliot didn't look away from the 3 men on the ground. His voice, when he spoke, was loud enough for everyone in the square to hear. "They assaulted His Royal Highness." That sentence changed everything. Even the groaning men went quiet. The one in the football jersey, now sporting a rapidly swelling eye, turned his head toward George with something that might have been recognition finally dawning. "Wait," he whispered. "Him? He looks like—" "The Prince of Wales' son," someone in the crowd finished quietly. Cameras that had been raised to record the confrontation slowly lowered. This wasn't entertainment anymore, this was history. And everyone present seemed to understand that some moments were too important to reduce to social media content. George stepped forward, shrugging off the protective hand on his shoulder. He straightened his jacket with the kind of unconscious dignity that seemed to run in his bloodline, then walked up to Elliot. The boy looked up at the man who'd just defended him with controlled surgical force. "Thank you," he said simply. Elliot didn't smile, didn't nod. But something in his posture relaxed slightly, and for just a moment his eyes focused on George instead of some distant point on the horizon. That was enough. The aftermath unfolded with the kind of controlled chaos that suggested extensive training in managing exactly this type of incident. Armed police arrived with sirens and flashing lights, but they found a situation already contained. Paramedics checked the three men for serious injuries, finding none that wouldn't heal in a few weeks. Security cordoned off the area while evidence was photographed and statements were taken. Through it all, tourists stood in respectful silence. No one pushed for better views. No one demanded explanations. The man who'd started it all, the one in the stained football jersey, sat slumped against the barrier while a paramedic examined his rapidly blackening eye. When a police officer approached with a notebook, he shook his head slowly. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "I thought he was just... I didn't know." The officer made notes without comment. Ignorance wasn't a defense for assault, and everyone present understood that these three men had just learned a very expensive lesson about the difference between ceremony and reality. George stood with his protection officer, watching the clean-up process with the kind of focused attention he brought to everything. His father would want a full briefing. His mother would want to know he was safe. But right now he was content to observe how systems worked when they had to work perfectly. The ceremonial guard had reformed at the far end of the square. The band had resumed playing, quietly at first, then with growing confidence as normal rhythms reasserted themselves. In 20 minutes, the changing of the guard would continue as if nothing had happened, because that's what ceremony was for, to provide continuity when everything else fell apart. As the police led the three men away in handcuffs, George caught Elliot's eye one more time. There was no dramatic salute, no formal acknowledgement. Just a moment of understanding between two people who'd found themselves in a situation neither had expected, and both had handled as well as they could. Later, there would be formal inquiries, reports to file, questions about protocol and appropriate response. But in that moment, in the ancient square where kings had been crowned and history had been made for 1,000 years, there was just a boy who'd stood up for what was right, and a man who'd protected him when words weren't enough. The crowd began to disperse slowly, families gathering children and couples checking maps for their next destination. But conversations were quieter than usual, more thoughtful. People walked away with something to think about, besides tourist attractions and photo opportunities. Near the edge of the square, an elderly man who'd served in the Royal Navy 50 years earlier stood straighter than he had in months. A young mother explained to her daughter that sometimes grown-ups needed to be reminded how to behave. A group of university students put their phones away entirely and watched the rest of the ceremony in respectful silence. Because sometimes the most important lessons aren't the ones you plan to learn. When the door opened and his parents entered, he didn't jump up or rush to explain. He simply waited, meeting their eyes with steady regard. Prince William approached first, his own expression unreadable. He'd received the security briefing, knew the basic facts, but wanted to hear his son's perspective before making any judgments. "Didn't ask permission," he said quietly, crouching down so they were at eye level. George held his father's gaze without flinching. "No, sir." But no one else was helping him. William was quiet for a long moment, studying his son's face for signs of defiance or regret. He found neither, just calm conviction and a willingness to accept responsibility. From behind him, Princess Catherine stepped forward. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she crossed the room and knelt beside George, wrapping him in a hug that was brief but fierce, the kind of embrace that said everything words couldn't. When she leaned back, her hands remained on his shoulders. "You spoke like you meant every word," she said. "I did," George replied without hesitation. William stood, walking to the tall windows that offered a partial view of the square. The ceremony was continuing outside. Guards marching, band playing, tourists watching with newfound respect for what they were witnessing. "Do you understand what could have happened?" he asked, still looking outside. George considered the question seriously. "Someone could have been hurt." "Yes, including you. But no one was. And Guardsman Marsh didn't have to choose between breaking protocol and letting them do whatever they wanted." William turned back to his son, struck by the precision of that observation. At 11 years old, George had identified the impossible position the guard had been placed in and had acted to resolve it. That showed understanding of duty that went far beyond his years. "You created an international incident," William said, but there was no anger in his voice. "I stopped 3 drunk men from assaulting a soldier," George replied. "If that's an international incident, maybe that says something about what we're willing to tolerate." Catherine and William exchanged a look over their son's head. In that moment, they saw glimpses of the king he might become. Someone willing to act on principle, even when it was difficult, even when it meant personal risk. "Your grandfather wants to see you," William said after a moment. George's posture straightened slightly, but he showed no fear. "Yes, sir." "He's not angry," Catherine added quickly. "He's impressed." Outside, the ceremony concluded with the precision and pageantry that had marked such events for generations. Tourists began to disperse, many of them carrying stories they'd tell for years about the morning they saw a young prince stand up to bullies and a guardsman risk his career to protect them both. In the security office beneath the palace, incident reports were being filed with unusual care. This wasn't the kind of event that would be buried in bureaucracy. Too many people had witnessed it. Too many phones had captured fragments of it. Too many conversations would carry the story beyond palace walls. But perhaps that wasn't such a bad thing. Guardsman Elliot Marsh stood at attention in front of his commanding officer's desk, still wearing his ceremonial uniform, but with his bearskin hat tucked under his arm. The formal inquiry had been brief. The facts were clear, the witnesses numerous, the justification obvious. "You broke protocol," the colonel said without preamble. "Yes, sir." "You left your post without orders." "Yes, sir." "You used force against civilians." "Yes, sir." The colonel leaned back in his chair, studying the young soldier with the kind of attention reserved for complex problems. "Regrets?" Elliot's answer came without hesitation. "None, sir." "Even knowing it could end your career?" They laid hands on a member of the royal family. "Everything else is secondary to that." The colonel nodded slowly. He'd read Elliot's service record, the commendations from Afghanistan, the psychological evaluations that marked him as exceptionally stable under pressure, the notes from his instructors describing him as a soldier's soldier. "You're being reassigned," he said finally. Elliot's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested he'd been expecting this. "Yes, sir." "Where to?" "Personal protection detail, close quarters work. The family specifically requested you." For the first time since entering the office, Elliot showed surprise. "Sir? Seems you made an impression on a young prince who values people willing to do the right thing regardless of consequences." Outside the colonel's window, London continued its ancient rhythms. Tourists and locals, ceremony and commerce, tradition and change all flowing together in the endless stream that had defined the city for centuries. But in the quiet offices where decisions were made and careers were shaped, something had shifted. A precedent had been set. A message had been sent about what kind of behaviour was acceptable and what kind of response it would receive. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of light that made Buckingham Palace look like something from a fairy tale. Tourists began gathering early, but there was something different about the crowd. More respectful spacing, quieter conversation, fewer attempts to test boundaries or seek attention through disruption. Word had spread through the networks that connected travellers and tour groups. Not official warnings or formal announcements, but the kind of organic communication that happens when people witness something significant and want to share the lesson without lecturing about it. Near the front of the barrier stood a young boy in a school uniform, his hand resting lightly on the rope as he watched the guards take their positions. His teacher had brought the class to see the ceremony as part of their history studies, but she'd also used yesterday's events as a teaching moment about respect, courage, and standing up for others. "Why did the prince help the soldier?" one student had asked during their discussion. "Because," the teacher had replied, "sometimes the right thing to do is also the brave thing to do. And sometimes being brave means speaking up when everyone else stays quiet. As Guardsman Elliot Marsh marched past with his unit, reassigned but still part of the ceremonial detail that represented centuries of tradition, the boy gave a small, careful salute. Elliot, without breaking stride or compromising his formation, acknowledged it with the slightest shift of his eyes. A professional recognition between two people who understood that respect was something earned through actions, not demanded through position. Behind the secured area, Prince George stood watching once again. This time he wore a slightly different expression. Less tension, more understanding. He'd learned something about leadership that couldn't be taught in classrooms or boardrooms. Sometimes leading meant stepping forward when others stepped back. Sometimes it meant speaking when others stayed silent. And sometimes it meant being willing to accept the consequences of doing what you believed was right, regardless of what those consequences might be. As the ceremony unfolded with its usual precision and pageantry, tourists watched with enhanced appreciation for what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a performance or tourist attraction. It was a living demonstration of values that still mattered: duty, honor, the willingness to protect others, even at personal cost. Children who might have fidgeted through previous ceremonies stood quietly, sensing importance in what they were seeing. Parents found themselves explaining concepts like service and sacrifice that they hadn't planned to discuss on a family vacation. The guards themselves seemed to stand a little straighter, march with slightly more precision. They'd been reminded that their ceremonial duties connected to something larger than routine. They represented ideals that people were willing to defend when those ideals were threatened. Near the end of the ceremony, as the final notes of the regimental march echoed across the square, something unprecedented happened. The crowd, several hundred strong, began to applaud. Not the scattered, unsure clapping that sometimes followed tourist events, but sustained, respectful applause that acknowledged what they'd just witnessed and what it represented. The guards didn't acknowledge the applause directly. Protocol didn't allow for that. But something in their bearing suggested they'd heard it and understood what it meant. Later, in the quiet moments after the crowd had dispersed and the square had returned to its normal rhythms, one truth remained clear in the minds of everyone who'd been present. Strength wasn't about size or aggression or the ability to intimidate others. Real strength was about standing up for what was right, even when it was difficult, even when it was dangerous, even when you were just 11 years old and facing down 3 men who should have known better. Prince George had shown that kind of strength when he stepped forward to defend someone who couldn't defend himself. Guardsman Marsh had shown it when he broke protocol to protect both the prince and the principles they both served. And in doing so, they'd reminded everyone present that ceremony and tradition weren't empty pageantry. They were the visible expression of values that still mattered, still commanded respect, and still deserved protection when they came under attack. What would you have done if you'd seen 3 grown men harassing a guardsman who couldn't respond? Would you have found the courage to speak up like Prince George did? Have you ever seen someone defend others when no one else would step forward? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one, and these conversations matter more than you might think. If this story showed you something about what real courage looks like, hit that like button. It genuinely helps more than you know. Subscribe and tap that notification bell so you never miss our daily stories about the remarkable people who uphold these ancient traditions. And if you know someone who needs to hear about the kind of strength that speaks quietly but acts decisively, share this story with them. Your next story is waiting right there on your screen. Click it, and I'll see you tomorrow with another moment that proves the same truth over and over again. Real courage doesn't announce itself with noise and bluster. It simply steps forward when stepping forward is what's needed.